tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. So friends, in the last several days of mindfulness, I've been talking about the stages of purification, which are mentioned in some suttas and also in the Vishuddhamagga. And the practice of meditation, as we find within the teachings of the Dhamma, the Buddha, are basically ways of purifying the mind of its defilements of greed, hatred, and ignorance. And so we talked about those beginning stages of purification, which means the purification of our conduct, purification of the mind, tranquilizing, calming the mind, and purification of view, learning how to better understand the nature of our own body and mind in the world, and then purifying doubts about it, and gradually strengthening and fortifying the mind with mindfulness, concentration, and understanding. Of course, the whole point of that is to free the mind of its factors and conditioning that keep ourselves repeating the same old habits of body, speech, and actions, and getting in, developing habits of unskillful habits that bring pain and suffering. So the mind is, for a long time been accumulating all kinds of wrong views and wrong habits and wrong ways of speaking and acting according to the law of karma, and having to experience all kinds of frustration, anxiety, worry, fear, and unhappiness, basically because of not understanding our mind. So anyway, I wanted to continue on this on the talks, going into more detail on some of these stages of the purification. And so the last time, in the last retreat, I was going over in more detail the purification of the view. And this means, according to the Dhamma teachings, to understand our body and mind is just a process of sensory contact, perception, and then reacting to stimuli according to our habits. And seeing the process of body and mind as a conditioned process in terms of the five aggregates of the body, feeling, perception, volition, and consciousness. And seeing how it's continually changing, and how within that also there's no kind of permanent entity or a person that actually is controlling the body and mind, but it's actually a process, a very intricate, deep, and complex process of, you could even call it a robotic process of just reacting to the various stimuli that come through our body and mind, according to how we've been programmed and trained, since the beginning of our life. And basically, according to the teachings of the Dhamma, developing wisdom is the real key to gaining liberation. Like there's a saying, wisdom will set you free. How many people have heard that saying before? I don't know who originally came up with it, but anyway. And wisdom is sort of the antidote for ignorance. And ignorance basically means ignoring the truth about the mind and body. In this world, lots of realities, there's lots of ignorance or untruth told about the things of the world, especially even contemporary things about the ignorance behind some of the things we find in our food and other types of things. People telling untruths about the harmful effects of so many things in order to because we found out the real truth about it, people might stop buying and using so many types of things. So the developing wisdom is an antidote for the ignorance about our mind and about what the deeper understanding about what our mind is, and especially the habits of the mind and how we get caught in those habits and in the law of karma. So after developing the purification of view, understanding that the whole process of the mind is just the process of mind and matter, or nama rupa, or the Buddha gave a nice discourse. He called the all. He was talking to the monks, and he says, "Monks," he says, I'll teach you the all." They go, "Really? What is it?" He said, "What is the all? It's the eye and seeing, the ear and hearing, the nose and smelling, the tongue and tasting, the body and feeling, and the mind remembering and cognizing objects." And this process is just coming and going at a very high speed. Just moments of hearing, seeing, tasting, smelling, touching, and thinking that are arising because of the context. And when those contexts cease, then the mind and the thoughts associated with them cease, only for others to arise. And so our whole life basically is just moments of hearing, seeing, tasting, smelling, touching, and thinking and reacting to those, and the whole life revolves around that. But normally we think it is I is doing all this thing, that I am hearing these things, and I am deciding to do this and do that, and I am feeling angry, or I am feeling happy, or I am confused. And we identify all these things as being I and me. That's because of our attachment and clinging and identification to them. Anyway, so the right view is the view of understanding that the sense of the I and the self is something that arises within the mental process itself, and that we've actually created it, and we keep on going, we keep on sustaining it and reinforcing it because of our justifications of why we should be angry, or why we should do this, or why we should do that, and not really clearly seeing the underlying process that's involved. And that's why most people remain trapped within their own mind and consciousness. And we've been kind of conned into believing so many kind of wrong views about it. So developing wisdom is important for learning how to begin that process of freedom. And so there's 3 levels of wisdom: the intellectual wisdom, and the wisdom that comes through reflecting and contemplating what you read, and then the wisdom that comes out of meditation or the deeper insight. And that's kind of the direct, non-verbal opening of the mind and consciousness. So in the process of meditation is also developing mindfulness, concentration, and wisdom. So we develop mindfulness, moment-to-moment mindfulness, to try to keep up with the moments of our body and mind, to begin to start to observe this moment-to-moment stimulation that's coming through our senses. So that's why even like in the walking meditation, when you're doing walking meditation, try to be aware of as the foot lifts up, as it swings forward, it lowers down to the ground, as the body shifts forward. We try to see that moment-to-moment progressive sequence of body activities. And while we're doing that, then the mind gets more focused, and we can also begin to hear how sounds just arise and vanish. Different sounds are coming and going also, and even our thoughts are coming up, coming and going. And so we develop that understanding of just coming and going, and try to keep up with that, the flow of the present moment. So you can understand that intellectually, but then in meditation you begin to see really how quickly that process is occurring, how many different stimulations are coming through your senses. Even in the space of 5 or 10 or 15 seconds, you can notice so many different body sensations and sounds just arising and vanishing. So that is the meditative clarity. You might understand it intellectually, but when the mind gets more calm and focused, and you actually see how rapidly that process of things coming and going through the senses, then that's a deeper level of understanding. And more importantly, you see how the mind tries to grab a hold of these objects. And when the mind tries to grab a hold of a certain feeling or a sound or a thought, then it gets dragged away into the past and the future connected with that. And then gets disturbed, either with greed or desire, and a whole series of thoughts drag you further and further away from the present moment. And you can see how suffering arises in that process too, the process of clinging to these various sense objects. So this is actually what you contemplate, in Vipassana meditation. This is actually the objects of Vipassana meditation are, tuning in to the moment-to-moment flow of sensory stimulation coming through the senses, in order to see how easily the mind gets either attracted with attraction to certain pleasurable feelings, or has this struggling and aversion for painful feelings. So how easily it gets caught in the tug of war between pleasurable and painful feelings, and the struggling that arises, trying to get away from unpleasant sounds or other body sensations. And we just observe that process. So, but I want to focus on more in this particular talk about the next stage of the purification, what is called knowing the purification of the way, or knowledge and vision of the way forward. There's a lot of people that meditate and they get either, they gain a little bit of concentration, and then, they experience some nice pleasant feelings, the mind gets very calm, and nothing is bothering them anymore, and it's very easy kind of just to space out, or just to kind of hang out and groove with whatever little pleasant sensations are arising, or that calmness, and becoming complacent with that. And basically the meditation kind of stagnates. It doesn't go further. Or people, other little phenomenon happening. You might see some, a pinprick of light within the mind. You might see some color or patterns, or maybe even a vision, or very blissful feelings, and you can think, wow, what is that? Or you think you could even, your whole mind might fill with light, and you think, oh wow, that must be enlightenment. And and so people also get sidetracked by clinging to these what are called little ornaments of meditation, or trinkets that arise during the meditation, and get sidetracked. So to get the mind back on the track, especially in terms of the path of liberation. So there's something called the 8 insight knowledges, which is called the purification by knowledge and vision of the way forward, of the way toward liberating the mind. And the first of those is called the insight knowledges into rise and fall. And this presupposes that a person has already gained a certain degree of concentration, and the hindrances have subsided at least to some degree, and you've reached that first stage of tranquility, where the mind is kind of resting in the present moment, and is awake, overcoming sleepiness or tiredness, and is very alert but very relaxed. And in that you start noticing, deliberately focus in on how quickly different things are coming and going, what is called rising and falling, or arising and vanishing. So like a sound, you're sitting there, or the breathing. So the in-breath arises, it lasts a second or two, and it stops. The out-breath arises, lasts a second or two, and it stops. So that's what's called arising and vanishing. It arises, lasts for a second or two, and stops. And then something else arises, lasts a moment or two, and stops. You might have an in-breath. That's why in this morning's meditation I tried to suggested that you try to follow that the in-breath, all the expanding sensations, and the in-breath, and then see how that stops, and then there's a pause. During that pause you might hear a sound arise and vanish, or feel something else, and then the out-breath arises and vanishes. So you train yourself on the arising and vanishing of the breathing process. But in between that, other things also arising and vanishing. Like maybe a little itch on your face, or a little body jerk, 2 or 3 sounds, a sound over here, a sound over here, maybe a thought or urge in the mind, oh, I want to shift my body. And so you specifically train on trying to notice how quickly these different sensory stimulations arise and vanish. Normally we don't, because the mind is clinging on to them. And so we normally don't see them vanishing. And we're not aware of how the moment they arise, because the mind is dull. And so those objects catch us and pull us away before we've really understood what is happening to us. We haven't seen how clear that object just arises and especially vanishes. So it's a very specific training of the mind, what's called anicca sanya, the perception of impermanence. So you're training yourself to tune into that, what's called tuning in to the flow of impermanence. Like you tune a radio dial to a certain station. Sometimes they're static, and you can't clearly hear the music coming over the station, but finally you get it tuned and then the music becomes clear. So in meditation it's the same way. We're trying to tune our attention first into the object of our concentration, such as the breathing. But once we've got that breathing in the awareness, then we tune it further into the arising and vanishing of other things that are coming and going around it, until it becomes very clear, so until you can actually experience within the space of 5 or 10 seconds, actually notice many, many, many different types of sensations, body sensations, sounds that are coming and going. And that brightens up the mind. Because normally our perception is very dull. And only the really strong things catch our attention, but everything else goes under the radar, so to speak. And so therefore we get attached to things and we get carried away by those particular stimulations. So we specifically tune our attention to how many things we can normally, that we can observe coming and going. So it's kind of the opposite of the idea of concentration, where you fix your attention on one particular object and try to blot out everything else and become totally absorbed in just one object. So this is kind of the opposite, actually, where we're opening up the field of attention. But the breath is still there in the background as the home base, so to speak. But around it, around that breathing coming and going, we can start to notice different sensations on the body, different sounds, thoughts, maybe a smell or a taste. But anyway, those the 6 senses that are just coming and going, the sense stimulations. And so we let that build up speed, because it's the clinging or attention that we give to any particular object is where you give the mind a time to drag in the past or future related to the object. But when you speed up the rate of perception, you're not giving the mind time to bring in the past or future connected to any particular object, because there's something else you can always notice. There's always something else you can notice. So if the mind starts to get caught on one particular sound, then hear another sound. When the mind starts to think about that sound, feel some body sensation. And so by deliberately speeding up the rate of perception, you trick the mind out of its clinging. And you also trick the ego out of itself. See, we've been tricked by the mind through the course of evolution and all the accumulated ignorance and conditioning. We've been tricked into being caught within the web of karma because we've never been taught about it. So in the process of Vipassana meditation, it's a process of out-tricking the mind out of itself by speeding up the rate of perception. Now, this is a very kind of high-tech thing, and only somebody like the Buddha could have really understood the mind and come up and devised a method for training the mind, which we can actually, that tricks itself out of itself. So you speed up the rate of perception. Again, because there's always something coming through the senses. And so we don't have to let our mind get stuck on any particular object. Even within the body, there's hundreds and thousands of body sensations continually arising and vanishing at subtle levels. So by tuning into that, the mind starts to enter this flow of present moment awareness. And so you're not giving the mind time to drag in the past or future related to particular objects, and therefore the reactions to those objects also ceases. So you speed up the rate of perception until it becomes very fast. And the reality of those objects also begins to disappear. Because objects only appear to be real when we're paying attention to them. And then bringing in the relationship of the ego to that object and getting caught up in desire and aversion. Then that object appears really, really real. But by speeding up the rate of perception, the mind doesn't have time to do that. And so therefore, sort of the hollowness of that object then appears more clearly, or it kind of senses, it seems to just disappear. And it's similar, the mind moments, this arising and passing away, the mind actually is similar to a reel of film. The old motion picture reels of film, which are made up of individual frames, right? How many people remember those old movie reels? And so it's a whole series of thousands of individual frames with a little space in between, right? And when you run it through a projector, real fast, with light thrown on it, then it appears like a smooth flowing scene, and you identify with the cowboys and the Indians, or the good guys and the bad guys, or whatever. This football team or that football team. But in reality, what you're actually seeing on the TV is just these, but you don't see the spaces in between, do you? So in our normal perception, we don't see the spaces in between these moments of hearing, seeing, tasting, smelling, touching, and thinking. Therefore, we think it appears to be a solid, flowing thing. And also the sense of ourself appears to be solid and real. Because we don't even see how the sense of self also is arising and vanishing with each of those moments. The sense of I is arising and vanishing. Now, this is something very peculiar to the Buddhist teaching. And only the Buddha could really have had the clarity of mind to see that. Normally people have the sense of their self or their soul or whatever they believe, and as some permanent, continuous kind of identity. But that sense of self, arises and vanishes with each of these moments of hearing, seeing, tasting, smelling, touching, and thinking. Anyway, so you speed up that rate of perception. Until you can see those actually moments of kind of seeing how quickly they just come and go. And then the second stage is actually seeing just the dissolution, that it builds up such tremendous speed, you no longer see them arising, but you only see them vanishing. That's what's called Bhanga Jnana, or some of you who've taken Goenka courses, they talk about Bhanga, which means cessation. But it means to see how quickly a sensory moment, a mind moment, vanishes, or how the reality of the mind, the reality of objects also vanishes. So, as you speed up the rate of perception, it's like an analogy of a train. If a train is leaving the station, and it's going slowly, you can see each of the cars with the space between the cars, right? But when that train speeds up, and with each acceleration in the speed, it gets harder to count the cars, right? Or to see the space between the cars. And when it's going really fast, it's like, they kind of even almost disappear. Because it's going so fast. Or a propeller. If you're flown in a propeller airplane, before it starts, you see, the 5 spokes of the propeller. Then it starts the engine. Then as it starts going faster and faster, you can't count the blades of a propeller until it looks like they've disappeared. How many people have seen that? When somebody speed up so fast, it's like it disappeared. So in the same way, when we speed up the rate of perception and are just being aware of different sensory stimulations just arising and vanishing, the mind doesn't have time to build up images about each object, and it seems like they vanish. So even the feeling of your body can vanish. And you're just, because you're feeling so many different sensations, the mind doesn't have time to think, oh, that's my hand, oh, that's my pain in my this or that. And so even the feeling of a solid body can also kind of disappear in the mind. So that is how, by speeding up the rate of perception, we can alter that perception process in the mind in order to see clearly how, the mind is operating at its deeper levels. So anyway, so we speed that up. And along with it comes the understanding of, anicca, dukkha, and anatta. And even when the sense of the self starts to because the self exists only in direct proportion to the amount of identification or clinging we have to any particular sense object. The whole sense of self exists basically for the past and the future. I'm going to get this, I'm going to be that in the future, or the past, going to the past, projecting into the future. But when there's no past or future, the self has no foundation to generate itself on. And so even the sense of self starts to fade away. And you can come to a point where, even the sense of your I starts to fade away. And actually it's a very blissful experience. It's a very joyous experience. At least if you can overcome that initial fear. In the beginning there might be some fear. Oh, I'm starting to disappear, And then the mind panics and kind of, clings onto something to bring itself back to its, I'm in control. But actually if you can let that go and let the sense of self melt away, that's actually the most blissful experience. So that's also the knowledge of Bhanga, when you observe the sense of self even fading away in the mind, and along with all the other types of identifications. So again, this is a very specific focus of attention. And so it's called the knowledge of cessation. But it's based on the understanding of the mind, the way the mind is creating these objects. And then the third insight knowledge is the knowledge of terror. And this means in those insights you realize the nature of suffering. You see how you're seeing how suffering arises because of our wrong views and the mind clinging to the five aggregates, or clinging to the sensory stimulations, and clinging to pleasure and pain. You see that very clearly because you see how all that ceased in these deeper insights. You see how suffering arises because of clinging. You see how suffering ceases when the mind lets go of that clinging and identification. It becomes very clear. And so therefore you get the knowledge of terror means terror of ignorance, not of the object itself. You're terrified and you, my God, how stupid have I been my whole life? Clinging to all these things, which are just created in the mind. And so, it's not a terror of objects in themselves. It's a terror of your own ignorant mind, and how we've been conned and duped and tricked into clinging to the things of the world as though it was something absolutely real, and not understanding the real truth, and why no one has even taught us this truth. So. And there's an analogy of the knowledge of terror. It's like 3 or 4 strong men dragging a weaker person toward a pit of charcoal. And we're going to throw him in the pit of charcoal, fire. So that weaker person would be terrified, right? He's being dragged toward this pit of charcoal. And he's getting, terrified that he's going to burn. Is it? Right? But the people don't throw him in the charcoal. Somehow they let him go. But he felt that heat, he felt that heat. Now he knows that the charcoal pit is a dangerous place. But now he's no more longer terrified. When he walks by, he just keeps his distance. But he sees that there's a danger of getting too close. So the terror begins to fade away, and then the knowledge of danger replaces that. So the fourth insight knowledge is the knowledge of danger. Again, this is just a mental attitude. It's not really thinking about it. It's just that you know that it's dangerous. you know that a hot stove will burn you, right? But you always go around having terror and danger of the hot stove? No. You just, keep your distance of it. You handle it in the right way. And it doesn't burn you. It only burns you if you handle it in the wrong way. Or any other types of objects, right? So, so that knowledge of terror kind of subsides into the knowledge of danger. That means clinging to any of the 5 aggregates, form, feeling, perception, volition, consciousness, leads to suffering. So that's the knowledge. And so you understand the danger in clinging. It's the clinging to these objects, not the objects themselves. It's the ignorant clinging to the objects of the 5 aggregates. And then the knowledge of dispassion arises. That means you understand how suffering has arisen because of your ignorant grasp and reaction to the things of the world. And so you become dispassionate towards them. That means you no longer have that strong craving and aversion to things of the world as you might have had before. They no longer arouse your lust and desire so much. All these beautiful, so-called beautiful or even ugly objects. And so the mind becomes more, equanimous. Or dispassionate. Because you know how everything just comes and goes. And then the knowledge of desire for deliverance. Then that kind of knowledge of wanting to become free of all of this attachment. And so you contemplate that also, and you contemplate, or it arises kind of naturally when you see how you've been trapped and caught by those things, the desire to become free from that. Like there's similes that the Buddha gave, like a frog trapped in the snake's jaws. So the frog would like to get out of the jaws of the snake. And that desire for deliverance, or a fish caught in a net, or so many other kind of examples. People wanting to get free from being trapped in something, or even use a more contemporary thing. And don't be offended if I, tread on anybody's situations. Like in a divorce situation, maybe people are wanting to get free from certain things, and then when they actually do, is such a relief. They become free from some kind of unpleasant situation. The desire to become free from whatever situation is tormenting them. So it's the desire to become free from ignorance again, from our own clinging mind. And then comes the reflection. And you go on and you keep on going back and reviewing the Dhamma. You go on reviewing all the different aspects of contemplation of the Dhamma. The 5 aggregates, the 6 senses in terms of the being impermanent, without any inherent self-nature or any permanent kind of core. And you keep on reviewing it over and over again, until finally one reaches a level of equanimity. So even all these stages can occur in one meditation period, in the space of 20 minutes, 30 minutes, an hour, or whatever, or in one meditation, depending on how much one has practiced, can get to that point. But then it comes to a point, there's a nice little simile given. It's called the land-finding crow. So in the old days, the sailing ships, they used to take a crow or a bird, some kind of a bird, let's say a crow, with them. That's why they call it the crow's nest, right? On a mast ship, sailing ship. And then when they're out in the middle of the ocean, they set the crow, let him go. So the crow flies, and if the crow sees land, of course he's probably wanting to go sit in a tree or something. If he sees land, he won't come back. He'll fly toward the land and won't come back. But if it doesn't see the land, it comes back to the ship. So the same way with our mind. Our mind might be getting really close to this point of, like feeling that dissolution happening, feeling the sense of self kind of fading away, and wanting that to happen. But maybe on an intellectual level, but even on a deeper unconscious level, if it doesn't see that nibbana as a state of peace, it will keep coming back to the body and clinging to the body, its feelings, its thoughts, and so on. But when the mind has been fortified in wisdom and has reached that level of equanimity, and if it sees the unconditioned as a state of peace, then it will fly in that direction, or not fly in that direction, but just totally letting go, and to experience the complete transcendence of the conditioned mind. But if it doesn't see that, if it hasn't fortified that knowledge and become overcoming doubts about it, that's the thing. When you get to that point, then some old doubts might come up. Well, maybe there still might be a little self. Let me see. Or there's still, that ice cream is still very nice. So, the mind comes back. So it can't fully let go. So you have to keep re-examining, and keep, whenever you see the mind, kind of keep holding it. That's how you have to keep going back and reviewing, the three characteristics, and so on. So that those insight knowledges, you can see how each one is kind of a stepping stone for the next one. And so you deliberately cultivate the perception of rise and fall, how by keeping up with the moment-to-moment arising and vanishing of things, and letting it pick up speed until the reality, the concreteness or permanence of those things begins to fade away, until you see them just vanishing like shooting stars going out in the sky. How many people have seen a meteor shower? You go out and you see something, and all you see, it was just vanish. You didn't even see where it came from, right? All you see is just pow. That's what is called the Bhanga Jnana also. You don't even see it arising. There's just vanishing like that. So those insight knowledges, that leads to then as I mentioned, the appearance of terror and danger. Again, about ignorance, not the external world. You're seeing the danger and the ignorance and the clinging you've allowed the mind to get enmeshed and trapped by, the whole life. And knowing that, there's a new way of relating to the world and a way of training one's consciousness. So again, each one of those is a stepping stone to the end. And then beyond that, the knowledge and vision of the way, the next insight knowledge is, it's called the ninth one, is called conformity knowledge, which the mind starts conforming to the truth. And this is like the crow flying out. It saw land, so it's conforming to that. It wants to go to the land. And that's called conformity knowledge. That the mind is actually conforming to anicca, dukkha, and anatta, not just giving lip service to anicca, dukkha, and anatta. Oh, anicca, anicca, or anatta, there's no self, but give me that, give me that. So it's actually conforming to the truth in terms of the metamorphosis of the consciousness. Like a caterpillar weaving its cocoon and then comes out as a butterfly. So that's also a little analogy. How the ego goes into the cocoon of meditation and develops this protective layer around it of insight, knowledge, and then comes out as a liberated consciousness, liberated awareness. So that conformity knowledge leads to the actual change of lineage. And then the stages of enlightenment itself. And there's another analogy. Let's say a man on this bank wanted to get on the other side. And then there was a vine hanging down from a tree. There was a river. There was a big vine hanging down. So a man wanted to leave this bank and get to the other side. So he runs, and then his feet leave the ground, and he grabs onto the rope. That's like the change of lineage. He's changed his position from this bank. Now he's on this rope, and he's conforming to what he wants to do. He actually, got the guts to actually run and make the leap, right? A lot of people they don't reach that stage to actually make the leap, right? So that's a conformity knowledge. You run and your feet leave this bank, trusting on the rope, and grab the rope. So now you're conformed. It's too late. You can't go back. And then you swing onto the other side. But what do you have to do? You have to let go of the rope. That's change of lineage. You've let go of that rope. And then the feet hit the ground. That's called path knowledge. Or, you've completed, you've gained the wisdom when the feet hit the ground on the other side and you experience that, those moments of liberation. Anyway, so that's just an analogy, some analogies that illustrate, the process of meditation, and especially the process that the mind and consciousness goes through in the practice of Vipassana meditation. But unfortunately, many people don't, build it up toward that level, because again, they get caught and trapped in the lower kind of little pleasant feelings of meditation or in different views. But this is the path of insight. It's a very specific form of cultivating the mind, but it's the path that leads to the end of suffering. So there's a lot more that can be said about that, but I just wanted to remind you of that, or explain, because again, people are always wanting to, or they're asking, what's next in meditation? They reach a certain point where they're just hanging out with the breath, and okay, it feels nice, or maybe they're feeling some pleasant sensations, some piti and sukha, maybe seeing some white light, or just contented, but and they tend to stagnate there, or they might wonder, well, what's next? Well, that's what's next. Is that you have to get the mind out of whatever rut it's in, or complacency, and to deliberately start to tune in to the flow of impermanence, because that is there all the time. Whether you're standing, walking, sitting, lying down, doing anything, the process of the mind and the senses is occurring all the time. And all you have to do is just pause, come to the body, and get a front row seat. And that's why the Buddha developed the 4 foundations of mindfulness. Because the body is where it's happening. The whole world is coming through this body with its 6 senses. And if you're not centered and grounded in the body, then that's the way we easily get caught and dragged, outside, or even dragged inside. So gaining that groundedness and centeredness in the body is really the first stage. It's like getting a balcony seat. So you sit down and you feel the body grounded on the floor, and you just let your mind spend some minutes just feeling how the body is, how the feet are tucked underneath, your arms, hands touching, just mentally feeling the posture, until you can kind of just, as though you were watching it sitting there, just sitting. And then you have a front row seat. And then you start observing so many little sensations that are coming and going. And sounds are coming and going. And again, you keep this objective observation. Hearing, feeling. Desire is arising in the mind. Anger is arising in the mind. And you just try to see each of these things as a momentary event. Not you or yourself doing it. It's just nature and conditioning that is going on and on. That's the right attitude of a meditator, especially of a Vipassana insight meditator, to cultivate that kind of objective attitude. So this is form, this is feeling, this is perception, this is volition, this is consciousness, just but without identifying it as me or I that's doing it. And then that's how those insight knowledges then grow out of that. So mindfulness of the body leads to mindfulness of feelings or sensations. And our thoughts are triggered off by the feelings and sensations going through the body and mind. So we start thinking about those and the perceptions, and dragging in the past and future. That leads to karmic actions. So we have to see how that whole process evolves. And that's the development of insight. You see it very clearly when the mind is calm enough and centered enough. So, anyway, I think that may be enough for this Dhamma talk. And for those who are staying tonight, at the start of the evening program, we have little questions and answers session, so I'm going to try to get some slips of paper for people to write the question down, and then we'll answer those questions based on anything that... or does anybody have any urgent or burning question about what I've just talked about? Yes?
Yes, Bhante, I had a very quick question and another question. Very quickly, my first question was, when you talk about change of lineage, do you mean lineage of the masters? And my second question was, in the beginning you mentioned the speeding of the perception process during meditation. And could you please explain what would be the difference with the speeding up of the perception process as opposed to the feelings, sensation? Like this morning I was meditating and I was feeling itches, but I also turned my attention to the hearing. So what would be the difference between perception and sensations?
Should ask one question at a time and let me answer it. But no, that change of lineage doesn't mean changing your lineage of your teachers or anything. It's a lineage from being a putujana, or ordinary worldling, an ignorant worldling, to the first stage of enlightenment. So it's the Aryan lineage. It's a lineage of the mind, from the conditioned to the unconditioned. That's what means change of lineage. Your lineage to ignorance, and now your lineage to wisdom, the path of wisdom. And sensations and perception, even a sensation, you perceive a sensation. Perception is basically also our consciousness. So you're sitting there and maybe there's a painful feeling. So the mind, that's a perception, a painful feeling. You can see the mind kind of wishing it weren't there. So that's a painful feeling, whether you call it that or not, that's what it is. The mind is that tendency to want to get away from it. And the opposite, the tendency for a pleasurable feeling, to want to get attracted to it or hold on to it. So that's a perception too. But it's also a sensation. But the sensation is just the pure vibration, but the perception of it being a specific type is a perception. The same way as a sound. The sound vibration is just a sound, but the perception divides it into the sound of a person talking as opposed to a car driving down the road, or somebody belching, or a door slamming. Those are perceptions, but they're also sounds, right? So perception is a sensation, but they're different kind of functions. I don't know if that answers your question or
not. I'm not quite sure.
Because a sound can also trigger a painful sensation in you, or a pleasant sensation, right? So the perception arises based on the sensation, or the sensory material, the stimulus. The contact, yes.
So with the perception, as you explained the last time, the difference would be when we label a sense, like one of the six sense doors. We hear something, we hear the sound, as you explained, the vibration. But when we hear it's a car, that's a perception. We don't hear the sound, the pure sound,
right.
But we say it's a car.
Yeah, once you created an object out of it.
Okay.
Perception is creating an object out of what was essentially just an empty vibration that meant nothing. Like you take a young baby, it could be sitting in a room, hearing all kind of sounds, but it won't identify anything yet because it hasn't been learned it yet, right? But only when it starts learning it, then it knows the sound of its mother's voice is different than the sound of its father's voice, and then starts developing attachments and aversions depending on those experiences. So that's actually a very important part of the insight training, is to know the difference between what is just a sensory vibration and how the mind distinguishes it as being painful or pleasant, and then turns that into an object. And then thinks about it. Just very happened, so fast. So that's what we study. That's called studying the Dhamma, actually. People say, I want to go study Dhamma. You study Dhamma by observing it occurring in your mind. Because that's all the Buddha taught, was how this process is occurring in your mind and how suffering is arising because of it, and how we get trapped in the web of karma, actions and reactions based on that. But that's really studying the Dhamma, studying your own mind.
So when you say, Bhante, that we keep the mind at the six sense doors, it means that we keep the mind at the level of the sensations, hearing, feeling, seeing,
yes.
But tasting, but not at the perception level where we would be saying, oh, it's an ice cream, or it's a song, I see a flower. We just see without defining the object.
Yeah, you're not going to do that immediately. So in the beginning, yes, you use your intellectual understanding and realize, okay, that's the sound of a car, but you understand why. That's a perception. And it's different than the sound of something else. But then later, as you stop clinging to these things, then the mind, even those perceptions begin to vanish. And they get merged into a kind of a one-dimensional thing. Like, for example, look, you're looking up here. Now probably you're seeing this shape standing out from, the Bodhi tree, you're standing out from, you see so many things behind, right? And you can make them out, right? That's because, the mind is constantly, taking these photographs. And those are the perceptions. But when those stop, if you weren't perceiving, this body would just melt into a one-dimensional thing. It wouldn't stand out separate from anything else. That's the process of two-dimensional, three-dimensional. The mind creates that. Otherwise, this wouldn't mean anything. It would all just be blended in. So in deep state of meditation, when you're flowing, when you tune into the flow of impermanence and not clinging and reacting, then that's how things seem to dissolve. Although they'll still be vaguely, you'll still be aware of things, but they have no more relationship to you or any absolute meaning. And so the mind stays in a very state of peacefulness because it's not being agitated by its identification with any of those objects. But at the same time, if you want to, you know that what the reality of those things is, what is called conventional truth, and then what is absolute truth. So in the state of meditation, actually in the state of wisdom, it's like you're sitting in a window sill. And you could either look outside and you see squirrels and trees and so on, or you can, look inside and, the house or outside. So in the same way, when you develop wisdom, you understand the conventional reality of things, but you're no longer deluded by that, and you're no longer trapped by that, because you're seeing the absolute meaning of it behind the scenes. And that is the skill of a meditator, to skill. We don't deny that the conventional world is there, that we also understand the absolute nature of it behind the scenes. Anyway, so I think that'd be enough for this talk.
Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu.